A little different. Good.
How'd you get through this?
What is that? I haven't started. I did a memo on the treasurer position. Idea. So I was just like, going researching this, but in this.
Yeah, yesterday I was like trying to get away from it, took a walk. And walked down the street, and some neighbors live on the. See what this is doing? I'm running this for it. And right away, it's like, what are you doing there? I was like,
Yeah, I have a rescue donkey and a rescue horse, so I just go ahead with them.
nice. Yeah, they probably won't.
Well, we're gonna give them 5 minutes and then we're just gonna go ahead and get started.
Okay, I met her back from Rick.
Yeah, I haven't heard back from Dave.
A second.
Luckily, we don't need a quorum.
No, we don't need a form. So, hello.
Send the cops out.
Really?
I only just heard about that a couple days ago.
What?
Sending the cops out for somebody?
No, it should be in the meeting
Yeah.
procedure. Absolutely. You need that to
We
a
don't
quorum.
have a quorum, so we can't vote on going ahead without them.
No, we're just gonna go ahead without
I think we
them.
should.
Yeah, all right. Sam, I'm just gonna let you carry on.
It is being recorded, so.
Yeah, so they can
Yeah.
listen to it later. So welcome, Sam. This is Sam White from CIRSA. CIRSA is our insurance agency, and Sam has come to us before to give us very informative educational materials.
Thank you, Mayor. Trustees, good to see you all again. Staff, thanks very much for having me over. Always nice to get out of the office and get out on the road and visit our members, particularly on the west slope. Love to get back over here, which is where I started my legal career over in Linwood Springs. So always happy to come back this way and visit with all of you. So again, my name is Sam Light, and I'm General Counsel for CIRSA. And that stands for the Colorado Intergovernmental Risk Sharing Agency. That's a mouthful, so we just call it CIRSA. And we are your insurance provider for workers' compensation coverage and also property and liability coverages. We're very proud of our relationship with the town of Paonia. Historical fact here for you, Paonia has actually been a participant in our insurance program since the very beginning, the very founding of CIRSA back in the early 1980s. So you joined our work comp program when we first initiated that program and our property and casualty program way back then as well. Just a little bit more about CIRSA. We're not a commercial insurance company. We're what's called a public entity self-insurance pool. We're organized under state law. We were created in the early 1980s when there was an insurance crisis for public entities nationwide, and cities and towns couldn't find insurance at any price. So one of the solutions to that was to allow cities and towns to essentially create their own self-insurance mechanisms, and that's what CIRSA is. To give you a sense of our size, we have 282 cities and towns within CIRSA. That's cities and towns and affiliated entities, things like housing authorities, urban renewal authorities, regional municipal governments, and so on. A little bit more about CIRSA. We're very proud of the fact that we kind of approach our relationship with our insurers a little bit differently than your traditional insurance company, your traditional commercial insurance company. You send in the claim, and that's about your only relationship with them, and then you sit back and wait. And your claim's either approved or denied. At CIRSA, we have all sorts of resources for you that are there for the town, as much or as little as the town would like to use those. We do take care of what I call the bread and butter stuff, which is getting the policies in place, the renewals done, right? Getting certificates of insurance issued, doing appraisals. Oh, knock on wood, we've got this one department called the claims department, right? And they handle the claims. But we also do other proactive things to help you manage risk. So those resources are there, as much or as little as you like. I put at Corinne's place a copy as well, but I'll hand around. You can pass these around. Just a handout on what our services are, so you get a sense of what things that CIRSA does to help you proactively manage risk if you would like those services. But most pertinent to tonight, one of the services we offer is trainings for elected and appointed officials around risk management in doing your job as an elected official. So that's what I'm here for. We have others in the organization that do trainings for others. Personally, I also do trainings for your staff as well. So we do other types of trainings, either virtually or in person. We're happy to do those for you, okay? I put a couple of handouts at your places that I'm going to mention as I go through the materials. I understand everybody's got a copy of our Ethics, Liability, and Best Practices Handbook, that little pamphlet. I hope that's helpful to you. We wrote that with you all in mind as elected officials, and it touches on issues that we think are particularly pertinent to doing your job at the elected leadership level. So take a look at that as well, and then the handouts I'll mention as we go through the material. I want to make the training as useful for you all as possible, so feel free to ask me questions as we go through the material. I'm happy to give you my perspective, CIRSA's risk management perspective on any question that you have, okay? But I get two caveats. First, although I am an attorney, this is not an attorney-client session, okay? And then second, before I joined CIRSA about 3 years ago, I did what Jeff does. I saw Jeff.
Yeah, he's up there in a little box.
What Jeff does for you, I was a municipal attorney for about 25 years. Actually started municipal law back in Glenwood Springs, in I think a predecessor firm to Jeff's firm. But in all that time, I developed a pretty good radar for what I call the live one. Okay, so ask me any question you like. I'm happy to give you CIRSA's risk management perspective. But sometimes it goes like this: if someone says, "Sam, I've got a question. What if another member of city council does this?" And everyone's eyes open wide. They go, "This is going to be exciting," right? So my radar is going off at that point, telling me, "Hey, this might be the burning issue, right, of the day in Paonia." That's where you want to look to Jeff if you need legal advice on that issue. Same thing with staff support, right? You've got some administrative issue going on or something that is in the purview of your administrator and staff, then I may give you a couple suggestions, right? But that's for your town administrator. You want to rely upon, get the support of, and use your administrator as a resource on those issues, okay? But again, feel free to ask me questions as we go through the material. I understand we got some newly seated elected officials, is that right?
Actually, all three of us guys.
All three. First time in elected office? Congratulations. Awesome. That's fantastic. Yeah, and then we have some
An oldie.
little bit of term, we got some terms under our belt. But I hope that, whether you're brand new or whether you got some terms under your belt, that there's some pointers and suggestions here that are helpful to you. Okay, next slide. Okay. I've organized my presentation around what I call suggestions for success, or commitments that you should make for success as an elected official, but as importantly, as a board. Okay, a lot of my presentation is about supporting and strengthening the institution of the Board of Trustees as a body, right? Because after all, we're elected to be a contributing member to that body. And the power held by the Board of Trustees is exercised by the board. And each and every one of us is a contributing member to the board. So success in our job individually as elected officials, right, depends upon building collaboration. Speaking in terms of we as a board, let's do this on behalf of our town and community, okay? So we'll talk little bit about that. My first, next slide. My first suggestion is to commit yourself to the role of public official and recognize that when you become an elected official, your role and relationship to the town changes dramatically, okay? You're no longer just a citizen of Paonia, right? You're now a government official, a public official, 24/7. 24/7 job, right, Mayor?
Absolutely.
Sometimes the 10 o'clock call, it's the 7 a.m. bumping you at the farmer's market, right? Okay? I'm not saying give up your personal life, and please don't, and please enjoy your personal life, but recognize this in terms of risk management and in terms of the community's perception. When you're interacting with your citizens and your constituents, right? And you know, the ones that know you're on the board, they will always perceive you to be a government official and a representative of the board and a representative of the town. That's true even if you tell them, this is my personal opinion. They're still gonna say, well, that was a trustee talking to me, right? And as they should, your words, your deeds, your conduct matters as government officials, right? It has an impact, has an effect, leaves an impression. In more difficult circumstances, it can leave a residue or it can even potentially create liability risk. So I think it's always important to keep in mind that my role has changed and now I'm always a government representative, okay? Also, you're no longer an outsider to town government. You're now the ultimate insiders, right? And here's how it translates to some risk. Once you become an insider, we all know that the town's got ordinances and the board's got rules of conduct and you've got policies and regulations that govern the way the town as an organization and the board as an institution and you as individuals must conduct yourselves, right? And that's true both procedurally and substantively. You get a lot of ordinances that say this is how the board processes this particular thing, right? Or substantive rules that say this is how the board decides this matter. Once you're an insider, those rules stick to us. And you don't have the luxury to say, I don't really care about that rule, I'm not gonna follow it. Or I don't like that criteria, it doesn't matter to me, I'm gonna vote yes or no for my own personal reasons. Once you're a government official, you're bound, right, to follow the rules and procedures that apply. That doesn't mean that you can't revisit, and you should, right? If a procedure's not working right or a substantive rule isn't where you want it to be, you have the right to look at those, and within the appropriate legal framework, you can change those things. But you have to commit to the point that in the rules that are in place, we have to commit to follow those, okay? Next slide. So newly elected folks, we took the oath of office. Phew, get that done. You gotta do that within 10 days, right? So I swear to uphold the Constitution and laws of the state of Colorado, right? And the ordinances of the town. So we're gonna talk about how that has meaning for you morally, ethically, legally, right? And maybe these don't come up every meeting, but they should be in the background all the time. Embedded in the oath are some core commitments, such as, right, a commitment to respect your role within the organization. Okay, we're going to talk about how within every municipal organizational structure, no matter how large or small, right, everyone has a particular role. That's true of the elected officials, the appointed officials, the full-time staff, and even the volunteers who step up and do things for the town, like at a volunteer event that you organize. They have a job description, right? And to be protected and for the organization to function effectively, everyone needs to understand what lane they're in, right? And also have an appreciation for the concept of staying in one's lane, right? So that there's not a drift outside of one's area of authority, which could potentially, in a worst case situation, create liability risk, but it could also cause the entity to no longer function effectively, right? If people are straying from their lane and doing things that someone else is assigned to do and vice versa, okay? It includes a commitment to lawful conduct, as I mentioned earlier, and then whether you knew it or not, once you got elected, you became subject to the Colorado standards of conduct for elected officials in Colorado. It also applies to appointed officials and employees as well. We're going to touch briefly in the time that we have on a couple of things: conflicts of interest, confidential information, a couple other rules that I hope are helpful to you. Next slide. For the new, did you like process? Who likes process? Process?
Depends on the process.
Well, this is your place. This is your place, okay? Local government, all government, but local government is a process, right? And sometimes that's frustratingly slow. That we deliver at the local government level is process. It's a substantive product of local government in and of itself. It's a place where our constituents, citizens can come forward and express to you as elected leaders, these are the wants and needs of the community. And then you all, the 7 of you, have the power and authority to decide at a governing body level, how do we put government resources, right, on those needs and wants of the community? Sometimes you're going to decide as a board, well, it's not a priority, or we don't have the resources, it's not within the budget, right? That kind of thing, but you have to commit collectively to provide good process in working through those issues for the issues that are within the board's wheelhouse, okay? The other responsibility of elected and appointed leaders in particular, in my opinion, is delivering the product of good governance, right? And I think that fundamentally that depends upon, in large part, committing yourself to some core principles, which are really civics principles in my view. If you commit yourself to the core civics principles that are listed on the left-hand side of the slide, then I think by and large, corresponding legal risk will take care of themselves. So for example, commit yourself to openness and transparency. And you're going to have few, if any, arguments, claims, disputes, or litigation over compliance with the Open Meetings Law and the Open Records Law. As but one example to that regarding that commitment to transparency, do you all get town-issued email addresses? Okay. So you're going to start, if you haven't already, you have. And you're going to use email to do your job, right, as an elected official, right? In the service of the requirements of transparency, do we understand that the emails that we send and receive wearing our hat as an elected official, by and large, are public records, right? There are a few limited exceptions that come up on occasion, but the state law says that the correspondence of elected officials, right, if it relates to public business or public funds or the duties or obligations that you have as a board member, those are fair game for public inspection. So it requires that you want to make wise and circumspect use of email as a public official. And at all times in public life, tone and temperament matter. But you know, the situation can come up where you may be drafting an email to just your one fellow trustee, and you think, well, that's my intended, that's the person who's going to read it. Somewhere down the road, somebody else might read that. That's just part of the, yes, sir.
I didn't mean to interrupt, just to
absolutely.
know if we should interrupt for a question.
Sure.
Okay. Regarding open emails, do you have experience with municipalities that have completely open, like default open emails that are shared to the public?
Well, it's getting into the weeds there about what that means, but the short answer would be no. I know of some municipalities that have systems for gathering up the emails of elected officials that elected officials send and receive, and then putting them in a separate publicly accessible file, either hard copy or electronically. And then I was aware of, not a CIRSA member, but aware of 1 or 2 municipalities that tried to comply with some of the rules around this by having elected officials' emails concurrently open to the public. It was like a live email thing, but they require some technology to do that. And I'm not sure if they're still doing it anymore. The way it can whipsaw is this, if we get into this more when we talk about emails is that, does that leave you the impression that if you're going to start talking about things by email, that you have a running open meeting going on all the time? Yeah, right. So my suggestion on it is that's probably not what you intended, probably not what the citizens expect, and it probably doesn't foster transparency, right? So yes, you're going to use email, but we'll talk later about what the open meetings law issue is and what some other transparency issues are around that. But I haven't seen that very often.
Estes Park uses a system like that.
Do they? Oh, okay. All right, very good. So it's a live, accessible system as it occurs.
I'm not sure. I assume there must be some delay because for the event that there's privileged information inside some emails that
somebody
probably should be redacted before they're posted.
Right.
But it's within hours.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, I wonder how that has been working for them in terms of the feedback they get from citizens. Do they use it to make decisions?
Not that I know of, it's just all the same rules apply.
Right.
You know, it's just, the conversation becomes public as it's,
Just affirmatively making them accessible without having
basically it's like a default.
requested.
Yeah, default court request.
Commit yourself to fundamental fairness. If you have any problems under the due process clause where someone says you've been violating my due process rights, but that most often comes up, as Jeff will tell you, is in public hearing settings. Okay, but from where you sit as elected officials, if ever you're feeling uncomfortable about process or have a question about process, things like, do we have proper notice? Or someone's standing up at the podium and saying something about, hey, there's something wrong with this hearing procedure. It's your right and prerogative, and I dare say, your obligation to slow down and then say, look, we need staff support, staff answer, help us as a board understand whether we're on good footing procedurally, right, so that you get that right. You want to be conservative in matters of process. Commit yourselves to being predictable and even-handed in how you approach everything you do as a board. But with regard to like the rules that you have, right, you have to commit to apply those in a even-handed, predictable manner, right? You're going to have certain corporate level requests to come forward to you as a board, like applications for, do you handle marijuana,
Yes.
liquor? Yeah. So you don't want to be a board where the vibe out there is, one applicant says, I went to the board and it was fine. The application criteria were simple. The application processing was very straightforward. The hearing was very smooth. I understood what was expected of me. I understood what the criteria were, and I got my approval, no problem. But if there's another applicant, right, who says, well, that's odd, because I feel like I had the same type of application, but now there are new and application requirements that I'm not sure where they're coming from, and there were some strange things going on at the hearing, and then most concerningly, then the board took a novel and unprecedented interpretation of their rules, and I got turned down. But oddly enough, the ordinances had never been changed. Is that a good spot to be from a risk perspective? Yeah. The actual legal risks are, that we see most often in that is equal protection and what's called a certiorari claim. That's just a claim that the governing body's decision was arbitrary or capricious. Wasn't grounded in either the evidence or in any existing rules that you had on the books. And I know sometimes you'll have hearings and you'll get a staff report and all the evidence will point to you must approve, right? Well, if that's the case, then you must approve. And then sometimes our members will say, well, they're doing some forensics on that. This happens a lot with land use hearings. They'll say, well, I feel like, we feel like as elected leaders that that's not really the type of thing we thought we were going to have to end up approving. Say, well, that's okay. If it was like development design guidelines, right, didn't do what you thought they were going to do for you, well, you can look at amending the development design guidelines. But you can't, in the middle of the hearing, try and pound a square peg into a round hole that gets you potentially running afoul of these principles. So commit to be predictable and even-handed there, okay? Finally, it may not sound like much of a predictor of risk, but I think it is, and that is commit yourself to mutual respect with each other, as colleagues at the dais, with the citizens that you interact with the staff that supports you. That goes a long way in managing risk. Because they're going to be, I hope it's not all your meetings, but sometimes you're going to have tough meetings, right? It's going to be a controversial issue. It's going to be a lot of people in the room, right? And it's going to be a difficult decision. And you're going to have, you may even have people standing up during the public comment portion on that agenda item saying, first person says, Mayor and trustees, do this. And the next person who stands up says, don't do that, do exactly the opposite, right? And you got all these different perspectives, and you're remembering at that point, oh yeah, this is part of the, I don't get to make everybody happy 100% of the time. But that's okay. If a great place to land is if those persons, somebody may go home from that meeting and say, hopefully they say, I get it now. The board's got a tough job. They have to take all those different opinions, all that evidence and information, right, and deliberate about it, talk about it as a board and come up with that one decision. That person may even say, I still disagree with what they decided. But you know what? I feel like it was a fair process. I feel like I was heard, and I feel like I was respected. What an awesome place to be in terms of building faith and trust in the board as an institution and in the organization. Oh, and then by the way, that's where the liability risks fall aside. A person who has the opposite reaction is usually the person who starts thinking about whether there's any way to legally challenge your decision. They'll go home and say, not only do I disagree with what they decided, right, but I feel like the decision was made before I got there, right? And I feel like there were strange things going on with the hearing, but they weren't listening to me. They wouldn't take the paperwork I was trying to give them, right? And I don't feel like I was respected. Those are the people who get mad enough to potentially think about how to challenge your decision. So mutuality and respect goes a long, long way, right? And that's all within your control, right? About how you set the tone for how you approach your business, how you interact with each other, how you interact with staff, particularly in the civil rights arena, but I think throughout every day-to-day interaction that you have as a board, tone and temperament matter, mutuality and respect, civility matters, and goes a long, long ways in helping you succeed individually and helping you succeed as a board. Okay. All right, next slide.
Please. The ceratory, what does that word mean?
Arbitrary and capricious.
Okay, let's pivot a little bit and talk about organizational structure. I mentioned the concept of everyone has a lane, right? Let me deal with a legal issue first, before I talk more generally and less legally about organizational structure. So when you first got elected, I hope your first question to Jeff was not, can I get sued in this job? But the answer is yes, right? So let's, I'm just at a 40,000 foot level here, just going to describe what the protections are, because we do have good protections in Colorado for elected and appointed officials and public employees, right? But it involves this. We got a law in Colorado called the Colorado Governmental Immunity Act, and it says the town, and by extension the town's insurer, CIRSA, will defend you and will pay judgments that are entered against you for acts or omissions as a board member. Sounds good. So long as, there's always a catch, so long as, right, you're acting within the scope of your employment and not acting in a willful and wanton manner. So two phrases there that are important. Scope of employment, probably sounds odd from an elected official standpoint because you're thinking, I'm just, I'm an elected official, I'm not a full-time employee. But that's the phrase that's used in the statute and it applies to everyone, elected, appointed, staff, volunteers. What it really means, the takeaway on that is staying within the duties, right, and authority that you have within your particular role within the organization. So it really is just understanding and appreciating your job description. As important, understand and appreciate job duties that have already been assigned to other people. A very important principle from your perspective is delegation, right? In every municipal organization, certain duties are delegated to, assigned to others in the organization, right? And who did that? Well, some state statute may assign particular functions to certain people, or you as a board or your predecessor may have decided that a certain function is assigned to someone else within the organization. You may have even decided that because it frees up time for you to do other things, to do the things that corporate boards do, and you leave to others in the organization the administrative or day-to-day operations. I'll give you some real simple examples on that, right? So within our organization, within whose job description is it to issue tickets in the municipal court?
Police officer.
The police. Whose job isn't it? The rest of us, right? Do you have business licenses? I've forgotten about that, so you probably got some. Whose job is it within the organizational structure to approve or deny the application for a building permit?
The administrator.
The administrator or the building official? Whose job isn't it?
Ours.
The rest of it, right? You, by your organizational structure or by state law, have already said that those functions are assigned to other people, okay? But here's where the risk lies, and it doesn't happen all that often, once in a blue moon, but sometimes we'll get a claim, and I'll get a claim that comes in and somebody got didn't get their building permit. And oddly enough, they'll name the organization, the entity, and then they'll name some people individually. I go, well, why are you naming individual elected or appointed officials? They have nothing to do with this, right? And even the claimant's counsel will say, I get all that. I read your org chart. I know what it says, and I read your ordinances, and I know that the building official is the one who has authority, right, to decide whether or not to approve the building permit, but that's not my allegation. My allegation is that there were elected or appointed officials lurking around behind the scenes directing that my building permit be denied or approved. That's a good place to be in terms of role discipline, not a good place to be, right? So you want to appreciate those concepts and make sure you use them for your own protection, right? That concept of allocation of duties permeates the organization. The other interesting concept is willful and wanton. Let me just touch on it briefly. I apologize if I sound like the Grim Reaper here, but you need to understand this principle. So you also lose those protections if you're engaging in willful and wanton conduct. Willful and wanton conduct is just this. It's conduct that's intentionally undertaken, it's designed to injure someone's protected legal rights, and is taken with reckless disregard for what their rights are. I got an even simpler way to describe it. I just call it bad stuff. Okay? And we know what it is, and we're going to stay far away from it. Right? But you need to know that there's this concept out there in state law that says if I am found as an elected or appointed official or public employee to have engaged in willful and wanton conduct, then my employer or the entity that I was elected to serve, they have no obligation to protect me. Your insurance works the same way, as is self-evident, right? It's just self-evident that public officials' liability insurance is not there to provide insurance from civil liability that flows from malicious acts or criminal misconduct or willful and wanton conduct. So it doesn't happen very often, but I'll tell you in my world, since we deal with all the downstream scenarios in the claim world, here's the most common fact pattern that we see that surrounds this type of risk. It's usually, well, it's almost always, an individual elected or appointed official misperceiving that they have some governmental authority that they don't have. Okay, throwing on that purported cloak of governmental authority and doing bad things to someone for the wrong reasons. And it really is truly, bad stuff. It's like going after a business competitor or a political enemy with no grounds for doing that, perhaps conscripting a staff member who may not be thinking clearly as well and going on a campaign to make sure that some license isn't renewed or something else bad happens. That's misuse. And that's the type of allegation, intentionally malicious acts, that kind of stuff. So we know what bad stuff is. We're going to stay far away from it, and we'll be just fine. But I want to make sure you understood the limitation. I want to hand on a silver lining because I don't. And so the silver lining is this: on the other hand, don't let the fear of liability drive your decision making. Right? If you know as a board that you're making the right decision, right, through a fair and defensible process, using clear and defensible criteria, you're going to be just fine, right? And don't stray the course just because someone's banging the podium saying, if you make that decision, I'm going to sue each and every one of you individually. That's what insurance is for. That's what this indemnity obligation is for, to protect you. Because sometimes you do have to take risks and make unpleasant decisions, and make decisions that ain't going to make everyone universally happy, right? But recognize also the strength in numbers, right? You need to be making sure that we're doing those kinds of things together in a boardroom, right? And that we're getting appropriate legal advice and staff support so that we're protected in that regard. All right, next slide. All this sort of harkens back to, let's get out of the legal weeds a little bit and just talk about organizational structure a little bit. So what's the town structure, right? And what's the board's job description, right? So a little bit of background. You operate as a statutory board administrator form of government. The more colloquial way that you'll hear that described is sometimes called the council manager form of government, okay? And I don't spend too much time on this, but in every municipal organization has the resources as you have to have that system of government, right? That's kind of a gold standard, and it creates this separation between policy and administration, okay? Where the board, the elected leadership, their lane, their wheelhouse, their job description is centered around exercising the legislative and corporate authority of the organization. That's in fact what it says in state law, that you're the legislative body, the policy-making body, right? And that your administrator and others within the organization downstream of the administrator are essentially your administrators or your executive officers, right, who are there to implement the legislation and policies of the board, okay? So that's the delegation of responsibility. Next slide. Another way to look at it is ask yourselves, right, for my tenure, for us as a board, where do we want to spend our energy? Where should we spend our energy? Under our organizational structure, where are we appropriately situated and where do we hold the power? And where have we given the power and authority away? You as the elected leaders, if you're in the ownership realm, who owns our corporation? The citizens, right? But who, what group of people, right, are the people chosen by the community, right, to help determine wants and needs of the community and broad themes of how we put governmental resources on that? You all, right? And your administrator and department heads and other folks, they're doing this stuff for you, right? It's not mutually exclusive, it's mutually supportive, right? Staff, by the same token, has to understand that there are certain jobs that are only within the purview, right, of the town board, such as who ultimately decides whether we're going to have a health safety ordinance of some type. I don't know, dealing with nuisances or animal control or some violation of the police ordinances that we have. Who makes the final decision on whether we change or adopt rules in that area? You all. Who decides whether this organization takes on debt? You all. Right? As we already talked about, it permeates the organization of like who deals with municipal court matters. Well, the police and the municipal judge, right? Who deals with building permit matters? Building department, right? Who deals with the administrative matters that you, through your procurement code and your budget, have already assigned to subordinate staff? The subordinate staff, right? So you have to trust in that system. You know, in the big picture, the governing body has the longest time horizon within the organization, right? You're the ones who are uniquely situated within the organization to think long-term planning. Where do we want this community to be and this organization to be in 1 year, 3 years, 5 years? You're thinking big picture in terms of what are the capital projects? What's our capital projects plan? What's our annual budget? I don't know if you do a 3 or 5 year capital planning budget, those kinds of things as well. The master plan, right? Decisions about corporate assets and resources. Should we buy a piece of property? Should we sell a piece of property? We need to go get more water rights. We should sell, no, don't ever sell water rights. That kind of stuff, right? All in terms of you're analogous to the board of directors of a private corporation. You are the directors of this corporation, it's just called a board of trustees, right? So you want to spend your energy and time dealing with those areas that are uniquely yours. That's your job description, is legislation, right, and corporate governance, resourcing the organization, being an ambassador and champion for the organization, and rely upon, right, your staff to take care of the day-to-day operations for you. Okay? Next slide. This adherence to the concept of role, discipline, and organizational structure is particularly important in the area of employee relations, right? So except for the board of trustees does have a couple of direct reports, right? You have an administrator, an attorney, and a judge. Is there anyone else?
Treasurer.
Treasurer, okay. But except, and you got a lot more FTEs than that, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So except for your direct reports, elected and appointed officials are not employee supervisors. By your organizational structure, you have assigned the supervision of employees to other folks. And you want to do that from where you sit, right? You want to have full-time staff that's familiar with and has expertise in and has resources available to handle supervision issues, personnel, employment issues. You want them to do that. And they love taking all that risk, right? They'll take that risk for you, as your organizational structure requires, because you've already assigned it to them, right? So you want to be careful of that and not get inappropriately involved in personnel matters, particularly individually too. I will say in our claims world, once in a while, there's some leakage on that issue, right? And an elected or appointed official, even with the best of intentions, gets involved in some personnel matter. But if in my world, it becomes a claim, if they're actually like a witness to what went on, or the people who are embroiled in a dispute said, well, I heard this from the elected or appointed official, or that elected or official appointed promised me this, then in my world, we're off to the races, because we're going to interview those elected or appointed officials and say, what was your involvement in this? If it's a real sticky situation and we're in litigation, we're going to take their deposition, right? And I've never had an elected official who got embroiled in a personnel matter that was not within the authority of the board ever say to me, hey, that litigation process, that was a lot of fun, let's do it again. Okay? Have faith in the system that you all created, right, by your council manager form of government. You do have accountability there, right? But where's your point of accountability for personnel matters subordinate to the administrator? Your administrator is your point of accountability for that, right? But have trust in the fact that if something is put in your ear about a personnel matter, you're going to unburden yourself of that and say, administrator, I heard this, and she's going to say, I'll look into it and I'll take care of it. And she'll probably keep you out of it unless it's such a big issue that there's something for you to know on a need-to-know basis. Why? Because that's the way the system was set up anyway, right? Yeah. But as I mentioned earlier, I was a municipal attorney for a long time, so I know that, sometimes it happens, someone's going to, can I talk to you about my boss? Do we have a ready response for that? Sure we do. We love and appreciate our employees, but I say no to you. But I as a board member and we as a board do not get involved in personnel matters at that level. I would encourage you to talk to your supervisor or HR or the administrator or whatever the process is for that, okay? Now I know sometimes, just getting one layer deeper, that sometimes you may hear something that sounds like it's got a lot of hair and warts on it. Can I talk to you about my boss? And before you can get those wonderful words out, they say, my boss is harassing me. Well, now I know something, or do I? Do I know anything? Maybe not, right? But now you've heard something, right? What's our response to that? It's the same response, except they say, my supervisor's harassing me. Well, we're not going to say, we love and appreciate our employees, you should go talk to your supervisor. No, right? But where are you going to go? Your administrator, okay? And trust that your personnel policies that you've already all signed off of have systems in place where there are other resources to deal with those issues, whether it be the administrator, the attorney. If it's one that has a lot of hair and warts on it, sometimes CIRSA, in support of its members, will help find our members outside resources to deal with those issues, okay? So if it really is, sometimes people ask me that hypothetical, well, what if I, as elected official, hear something that's really blockbuster, right? Well, remember, go back to your org chart and say, elected official, it doesn't say HR manager, right? I didn't put on the ballot HR manager, right? I put elected official, policymaker, legislator, that kind of thing. So you want to find a way to unburden yourself of what is going on there. And then you can check with your attorney or administrator and say, is that being appropriately attended to? Okay. And they'll report back to you as needed. Okay. Same thing applies to administrative matters. I think I touched on that with my building permit example, right? There are certain, and it's interesting, this mutually supportive concept of organizational structure. There are some issues that do start as a policy issue or a board level issue. Like land development's a pretty good example of that. There might be something related to a development that is your decision. You know, the subdivision request or the zoning request, or do you do conditional uses or special uses? Yeah, you decide whether or not the conditional use or the special use is approved. But once that approval is given, it shifts to an administrative process, right? So even if you were on the no side, you didn't vote in favor of that particular development plan, you have to appreciate that once it's left the board, then the board is done with that issue, right? And you can't continue to hold on to that. To give you a war story, I had a mayor who was on the 3 side of a 4-3 vote on a controversial development, and after the decision was rendered, the mayor went to the building department and said, by the power vested in me as mayor, I'm directing you, the building department, not to issue building permits for this project. Good idea? Not a very good idea, right? So again, as I reach back, remember I said that sometimes, particularly in land use, sometimes the rules don't work exactly the way you thought they were. but you've done the right thing if all the evidence pointed under your existing rules to a yes, right? Well, you can do some forensics later with your planning department or your administrator or attorney and think about, well, how can we change the rules to get us as an organization, a community, closer to the mark of what we want as a community? But that's got to be a legislative process, right? And you have to avoid that risk issue of holding on to something, right, after the board's already acted on it. Okay? All right. Next slide. You do have an appropriate role in personnel matters, right? You do, I think you do set the general personnel rules that apply to everybody. Is that right, sir? Yes.
Sorry, Sam, before we get away from your last slide,
Yeah.
I want to ask, in a situation where the town manager himself may be involved, our previous town manager here had some, he would show up a lot of the times, and our clerk at the time, so I hear, brought their concern to the mayor, where no action was taken. So if that's the case, what is an appropriate process for the board to, or what the clerk in that instance to, like, would they then be, should they come to the board?
Yeah, well, the clerk was wanting to express a concern. Once that's been transferred, who owns the responsibility to supervise the administrator? The board, not the clerk, the board. So you're gonna have to decide what your process is for that, right? And you've gotta appreciate that sometimes that's a give and take, right? But you wanna have mutually acceptable and agreed upon systems for evaluating the performance of your direct reports. And I suggest, do that more than once a year. It ought to be more of a interactive and mutually supportive process where we're checking in on work plans, right? Where we feel like we have running both directions a safe and appropriate space every once in a while to check in, right? Because that could, in this example, provide an opportunity to raise that issue, and there may be a ready explanation to that, right? Now, on the other hand, I have seen dynamics where an elected body, they'll have an executive session for a personnel matter for the performance review of the direct report, and they're only allowed to do that if the direct report has not requested discussion in open session. But let's say they haven't, they said, that's fine, you can, right? But you get in there and you start, everyone brought maybe their thoughts and concerns about performance, and then you realize, well, gee, I guess I'm the only one who's stuck on this particular performance issue. What happens then? That's where you have to be on board with the collective view of the board as a board, right? I used to have a director who once said, well, when we meet as a governing body, our first question is, are we supportive of our chief executive officer, right? And if the majority, it doesn't have to be 7-0, but if the majority say, yes, we are, then everything we do downstream of that is in support of our chief executive, unless and until that view changes, right? Yes?
Sorry, I may have, my question.
Sorry.
Misunderstood.
Yeah.
As you were describing before,
Yeah.
how when it's inappropriate for, say, the clerk to come to a board member and say, like, I have a problem with my boss.
Yeah.
In this particular instance, since the boss does report directly to the board, is it appropriate for the clerk to approach the board in that instance, do you think?
It could be. I mean, you have to decide on how you want to do with that, If
Right.
it depends on the issue,
Okay.
too,
Well, I appreciate your, I think that your other response
Yeah, there's,
could preclude the need for the clerk to come, but yeah.
yeah, there's a whole world about whether you get into a rules-based approach to this, and Jeff may have suggestions for you at a later time. If you get into a rules-based approach on that, it's like, do we want to, as a board, have an adopted process for grievances? What does that look like? And then it's structural.
Okay, that was, my question, thank you.
Yeah, so you do have an appropriate role for certain things, right? We talked about direct reports, personnel rules, determining the overall structure of the organization, the annual budget for personnel, the structure of departments, probably the ultimate number of FTEs, that kind of thing. But recognize those are broad across the board things. That's a whole lot different than giving direction to individual employees, because after all, right, neither any individual board member, right, is the supervisor of an individual employee. And I think you have to be sensitive to the impression that leaves if you do that, right? I think it's fine large or small organization, and your administrator will chime in if I'm speaking out of turn here, but you have to be collegial and friendly with staff members and, ask them a question about the status of a project, that kind of thing. But I think that's markedly different, right, than approaching a staff member with what will appear to them to be an order or direction or a suggestion that you want them to do something, right? Imagine where that leaves them. They're wondering where's the chain of command now, right? Particularly if it's different than what a supervisor is telling that employee. Have you just undermined your supervisory chain of command, right? Because once that starts happening, how do you ever get the chain of command back if people are engaging in activities that undermine your own chosen organizational structure and chain of command, right? So be cognizant of that. And resolve to speak with one voice to your direct reports as well. Right? I know that's not easy sometimes. Sometimes the mayor is you're finishing the discussion and say, okay, let's give Corinne some direction. You got one idea of the direction, you got your idea, you got another idea, like 7 different ideas of what the direction ought to be, right? And the mayor says, Corinne, have you got your direction? But who owns that issue? The board. And when I say the board, what do I mean by the board? The board as a board, the institution of the board, right? I know sometimes that can seem intractable, right? And the mayor, in her wisdom, maybe one of those dark arts that mayors practices, may realize, hey, this is an intractable situation this evening. Let's let it ferment a little bit. Let's roll this item over, this discussion item over to the next meeting. But you have to collectively commit to pick it back up and resolve it. Because when you speak with one voice, that's where you get clarity and credibility and accountability in what your voice is, right? Because if you don't resolve it and you leave it hanging, you can have this kind of dynamic. Maybe after the meeting, a couple days later, people are dropping by the administrator's office and saying, well, that was kind of a messy discussion the other night, but here's what I'd like you to do. Is that strengthening the institution of the board? It's undermining, right? It's ultimately because what's going to happen then is then other members hear that went on, and then they'll drop by and go, here's what I want you to do, right? So you owe it to each other at the dais, right? Right? However long it takes and however difficult the discussion may be, you put it to a vote if you need to, right? Of this, we got to resolve to speak with one voice to our direct reports so that we strengthen our relationships with each other as board members and with our staff. And after all, your direct reports are only accountable to the voice of the board as expressed by the board. So if that breaks down, right, you have to admit to yourselves that you have to take the humility and say, well, why is this happening? Well, is it in part because we're allowing or engaging in activities, right, that allow the system to break down where our strength is being eroded because of our own individual activities, right? So I have to think about all those dynamics, but resolve to speak with one voice, and that'll take you a long way. Next slide. Here's some tips just to wrap up this stuff. These are not necessarily directly related to third-party civil liability risk, but just a couple more suggestions around role discipline. We talked about understand the job description, stay within that. Use your administrator as a resource to help you do things and look good while doing it. And here's an example of that. Do you all get emails from constituents?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Yes, please, say that with a chuckle, okay. And sometimes those emails, they're in your wheelhouse, so they relate to some policy issue, right? Oh, with the email about, hey, board, I see you're voting on the budget next week. I'd really like to see you increase the budget for marketing for the farmer's market. That would be great. That's the wheelhouse, that's your policy decision that you're gonna make. But sometimes using a simple example on the other end is somebody who says, dear trustee, I got a traffic ticket, and what are you going to do about it, right? Right? And then there's this whole world of emails in between, right? So from where you sit, take a look at that email and say, is this for me, right? Or is it for the board, or is it for the administrator? And a lot of emails that you're going to get are born out of the best of intentions, but they're misplaced in terms of it's someone reaching out to you about an administrative matter where you can use your staff to resolve the issue and also support you as elected officials. So somebody writes you about a project, hey, I'm upset about that project, how come it's not done, what's the status? You can send that over to Corinne, She may not have the most current information, but she goes to Public Works, right? And folks in Public Works, the director there, hey, would you reach out to that citizen, answer their question, right? And then your administrator can report back to you, hey, we got back to Citizen Sam, and let him know it was up for that project. Next time you see Citizen Sam, hey, did we as an organization get you the information that you need? If they thumbs up, that's great. If not, it's a thank you. We can always find ways to improve. Thanks for your input. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So here's two examples.
Yeah.
One, I got an email from a constituent saying, I disagree with the 1 hour lunch break that people are taking. Employees are only working 6.5 hours a week.
Yeah.
A day.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so that was one email. Another email was, there's a water leak behind our house and it's really huge. It's underneath a slab and we think it's on town property.
Yeah.
So like in the first one, I was too tired. I just said, I'm trying to move into a house, which I apologize for being late, but I'm still working on the electric and pulling wires today. So sorry I didn't get here earlier. But that first one I said, look, you know, you're gonna have to have some tolerance. I just can't answer that right now and it's too much in the weeds for me. And then the second one was, have you talked to our administrator about this? Have you called the administrator? So
Yeah.
those are just two examples I got.
Well, the first one, and Corinne help me, is it the board that decides the personnel rules and benefits?
Yes,
Yeah, okay. So I don't know where that issue sat, but you have to decide. You're gonna get a lot of things that come at you that you didn't anticipate, didn't invite in their questions. You gotta decide how many resources you wanna put on them, right? I'll give you two kind of potential responses to the first one. And by the way, my radar is going off a little bit, so if these are burning questions of the day for which you need legal advice and staff support, please do that. But one way to look at that email is, well, thank you for your input. We appreciate your perspective, but our rule under our personnel policies that the board just adopted and which we support is that we give our employees this. And that's the end of it. And, you know, unless and until you decide that you want to put on your work plan that issue or any other issue under the personnel policies that you approved or adopted.
so our personnel policy does not have anything in it at all
Yeah.
about breaks or lunch hour.
Okay, okay. So that becomes a question then of whether you want to look at that issue or not, or if it's, is it on our radar, is it on our work plan? It may be, have you already delegated to staff? That's where the other issue comes in. Some people don't know the underlying question that I'm encouraging you to look at when you first get the email is like, in whose wheelhouse is this question? If we as a board already said that our administrator, this is particularly true of home rule municipalities, right? I don't know what your ordinances say, but a lot of them will say it's the city manager who's responsible for making and adopting all the personnel rules, in which the response is markedly different. And say, well, you know, give you a city manager heads up and say, it might be coming an inquiry coming your way, but somebody asked me about the personnel rules and I sent them to you, so take care of it, that kind of thing. And your second one had to do with the water line break?
Yeah, water leak that they thought was on town property.
Yeah, so you've got through your organizational structure and all the authority that you've already signed, you've got somebody who's responsible for looking into that, and that is?
It's not us.
Public Works Director, but who's your point of contact for administrative functions?
Administrator.
So you can forward that email on to Corinne, say, hey, I got this email regarding a potential water line break, could you take care of it? She's gonna contact Public Works. It's on, there's some lack of clarity about whose property it's on, there's gonna have to be some discussion about how we approach that issue. But again, you know, the ballot didn't say you were running for HR manager or Public Works Director. That's not to say that you push these things away with a stiff arm, but it's say mutually supportive of the organizational structure to say, thank you for that. I'll forward it on to the folks who can look at that issue and they'll reach out to you or something like that, right? Is that helpful?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Recognize that as the governing body, you primarily do your work, and in fact, you can only take action as a board collectively in a group. There's 7 of you, and there's sometimes a temptation to say, well, I hold 1/7 of the power, and you know, I'm going to go out and use it. But you won't find in your ordinance books, except for the mayor's presiding officer prerogatives, things like that, you won't find any ordinances that say the power of the board is exercised by any single board member. It's exercised collectively. And from a legal risk perspective, there's safety in numbers. And that is when you're in this room, it's very clear what you're acting on. You're acting on agenda items that come in front of you in a meeting, right? And there's all sorts of legal privileges that attach to what you're doing, legislative privilege, so on and so forth. And it's just self-evident, right, that it's harder to get in trouble individually when you're doing things collectively as a group. You can almost hear it now, right? My extension of my pounding the fist from the dais. I'm upset, you know, and if you board do that, I'm going to sue. Well, I'm just going to sue you individually. And you're thinking, what are you talking about? This is a collective decision of the board, right? You can see the individual risk exposure is much less, and there is safety in numbers. My last suggestion on this is this doesn't really translate to a liability risk, but it does translate to something that, in my experience, a wise board puts some attention on. So do you have, during your meetings, that opportunity for board comment? Like where near the end of the meeting, you call for board reports and each board member gets to make some comments?
No, we haven't done that.
What about before adjournment, you say, even if you don't have it formally on your agenda, you say, Mayor, before we adjourn, I've got something to report. And you say, you know, since our last board meeting, I did this. And everyone else goes, you did what? Right, all the other board members. So that may not translate into any third-party liability risk, but it does suggest this. Have we as a board talked about it, right? And do we have agreement upon our mutual expectations for each other in terms of how we represent the institution of the board and how we represent the organization outside of our meetings, right? And I mention it because I want people to be supported and protected if they volunteer or ask or are the member who's not present and thus are conscripted into doing something for the board. Now, but if we had, Mayor, would you go talk to the county? Right? Oh, sure, I'll do that. But when the mayor comes back and says, I went and talked to the county and I said this, we don't want the reaction to be, you know, you said what? Right? So it does require, that's a fuzzier part of the job because it's not usually an agendized item. Right? But if we as a board are thinking about, hey, there's something we need to do in between the meetings, who would like to represent the board on that issue? Are we clear and supportive of that? Or on the other hand, if somebody comes back and the rest of the board's thinking, well, you know, you shouldn't be doing that. That's not part of our role. That's what our administrator does, right? Do we have the willingness, the ability to have the eyes-up conversation about, hey, let's recalibrate. These are the things we should be doing. And these are the things the chief of police or the administrator or the clerk or whoever it is should be doing on our behalf. And that's how you're going to make sure you're firing on all cylinders as an organization. Okay. All right, next slide. I did have one more slide on that. That is, there are a couple of personal commitments around all this role discipline stuff, right? And that requires that sometimes we do have to set aside a personal agenda when there's lack of support. You know, even may have run for office on a particular platform and I have this single policy idea that I want to get through. Right? But if I can't find 3 colleagues to come along with me, I have to be willing and I have to recognize that I have to put aside my personal priority in view of the service of the work plan and the agenda of the board as a whole. You can keep working on trying to get more support, right? But it takes a majority or consensus of the board to define the work plan of the board. It also requires, I think, you have your fiduciaries in a legal sense, right, as well. It does require recognition that once the board has spoken, I think you have a fiduciary obligation not, right, to undermine the decision of the board. Now, if it was a 4-3 vote, I suppose you can still tell your constituents and citizens, hey, you know, I didn't vote for that one. But is that, even that may not be, you know, might be a kind of eroding the board a little bit, but you certainly, I think, have a fiduciary obligation to not do things that attempt to undo the decision, like the mayor in my building department example, right? Okay, let's keep going. Next slide. All right, let's talk about transparency issues. Any final questions on the organizational structure stuff? Yes, sir.
One real quick, regarding CIRSA requests by trustees. In that instance, we're somewhat, like, not as trustees, but being a trustee, we're compelling our employees to do a task that is maybe would be considered say I request some documents, right? May be inappropriate depending on what roles have been designated to be by the board. But as a citizen, I have the right to those documents through CIRSA or through a court request. I'm sorry, I said CIRSA, a court request. So in that particular instance, do you think that there's any ethical, is it okay to use a court request to compel staff to give you something that may be inappropriate or something outside of your designated role?
Well, I won't opine on whether it's okay or not. In the organizational structure side of it, I'll say, is it the most mutually supportive way of, helping the organization along? Now, staff's got to take its salt on that too, right? If the staff's view is it takes a court request to share public records with the elected officials, is that really where we need to be on that issue, right? But the board's also got to recognize, is it a proxy for the issue? Sometimes we see, and people ask us if there are guidelines on this issue. What if you have certain members that want a lot of documents and have a lot of questions and are using a lot of staff time for their individual requests that may have nothing to do with the work plan of the board, right? Is that diverting resources from what you all agreed was your work plan? Probably, right? And so ultimately, it probably squares itself in terms of what are we doing as a board? What am I doing individually? Is it supporting the work plan, or am I trying to go it alone? It's a collective job. It's a collective job. Yeah, and it's hard. You never take all. Yes, anyone has the right to make a court request, but in terms of how it appears in the dynamic, you're still a government official, right? So I think one way to talk about that is whatever your retreat setting is, or whatever your time with staff is to talk about information flow, talk about your norms and expectations around flow of information. And I even brought some with me that I'll leave behind, right? And one of them on there was, there's norms that you talk about, and as best you can, you decide whether they're unanimous or at least what the board commits to. Norms around governing body issues, such as when I have an idea that I want the board to take up, I will do this. Right, but on this particular issue, when a member wants more information or has questions about an item, right, on an upcoming agenda or not an upcoming, we will do what? And there's a whole menu of potential options on that. But it's hard to impose those kinds of things. It's better to have buy-in as best we can, and better to talk them through and see if we can agree upon a process around that. Is that helpful?
Yeah, very much. Thank you.
Okay, let's pivot and talk about transparency. That's not a legal term, but that's the buzz phrase. So commit yourself to transparency. Before I get into some of the legal stuff, just recognize that your citizens appreciate your commitment to transparency. With whatever resources you have and whatever it looks like to you, right, do things to help foster faith and trust in government by being transparent. You got like a wonderful website where you can go and find agendas and things like that. Citizens may not be standing up and applauding you every meeting for your commitment to transparency, right? Or filling the room to do it, but maybe it's because they can find information readily and quickly see, oh, I can get the agenda in the minutes, and I can check in, and then they're comforted because they can just check in on what the pending town business is. So whatever that looks like to you, I think that's a good commitment of resources, right? And staff time, right? Because if we know there are high-profile projects or items, if we can make public information readily available on those issues, then that frees up other time and energy for other things. So whatever that looks like to you. All right, but I want to pivot and talk about the open meetings law. The mayor knows this, and you've all probably heard this from Jeff already, but you're all subject to the open meetings law in Colorado. And it's got a lot going on there, but it basically says this. It's got two main rules. Whenever 3 or more members of the board meet to discuss public business, that's a meeting that has to be open to the public. That simply means a citizen has a right to observe the discussion. The second rule is that if it's a meeting where there's going to be a 4th member present, or you're going to take some kind of action. That's a meeting that must be preceded by notice and an agenda, and that's what staff does for you. So that's it. That's it. That's easy enough, right? Couple of nuances. The statute expressly does not apply to purely social gatherings or to chance gatherings, okay? So even if 4 of you just bump into each other at the coffee shop, the physical presence of the 4 of you is not a violation of the open meetings law, okay? But whether it's a social gathering or a chance meeting where you bump into each other, right, the discussion of public business cannot become a primary purpose of that gathering. So you could not, for example, 4 of you bump into each other at the coffee shop and say, oh, you know, while you're here, we've got that big discussion tomorrow night about amending the budget, and you start talking substantively about all the things that you have to decide tomorrow night, right? What is the problem under the open meetings law? 4 of you, there's no notice, right? And it's not open, right? So keep those concepts in mind. Yes?
Just, I want to make sure I understood. So I've always thought that if you have more than 2 members, you have to notice it. So you just mentioned 3 as kind of the magic number.
Right.
That you can get together, but not notice it as a public meeting. But is that
Well,
what you said?
there's perhaps some area that can be navigated in between, but frankly, 3 or more, right? It says if it's a 4th, or you're going to take any kind of action, which is not just final action, it's any course kind of recommendation, decision, anything, that it's simpler just to describe it in terms of 3 or more, right?
So a committee, let's say a committee's meeting, and there's 3 members of the committee.
Yeah.
Sitting down and talking about, well, they're talking about town business, so that should be noticed.
If you created that committee and it's part of your policy-making process, you assigned them the job of helping you make policy. My radar's going off a little bit. Check with Jeff to be sure. But the open meetings law says it applies to any local public body that's been delegated or assigned a governmental decision-making function, which can include recommendations to the board. So if it's, keep it in the vernacular, if it's your baby and you created it and you sent it off to do a job on your behalf, and in my view, it's one of your formal committees, and then the committee itself is also subject to the open meetings law, okay? But in there, there's some nuances, right? There are some committees, and there's even cases around this issue where the government is taking the position, well, they were never assigned a governmental decision-making function, or they were a purely administrative committee, or some other nuance was going on. So you'll want to check with Jeff, but in general, if it's a policy-making committee that you formally created, right, then it ought to follow the open meetings law as well. Yeah.
And does it apply to 2 people who were assigned that decision making?
I'll use an example from one of my former clients, which is a city up on the Front Range. So we created committees of 3 of council members, gave them job descriptions like a finance committee. But there were 3 members and only 2 of them were elected officials, right? So the rule applies this way. It applies to 3 or more, or a quorum, whichever is less. So if you have a formal committee consisting of 3 members, a quorum exists when there are 2 of them. The county commissioners run into this issue all the time because most counties have how many county commissioners? 3. Yeah. Okay. If the open meetings law applies, it simply requires that the discussion be open and you're making public policy, right? And it's pretty straightforward to comply with the open meetings law by just posting a notice and an agenda. So it's not particularly onerous, and it's probably in furtherance of transparency, but you're going to need to look at each and every situation you have, consult with your attorney and staff on what is the role and function of that, and make a call on how those rules apply. Or you could do what some cities do, and they say every entity subordinate to us or not, whatever their argument may be that they're not, we're still going to say, as the governing body that created these things, we're going to be the ones that say every subordinate committee, no matter what its size or function, shall conduct their business in accordance with the open meetings law, and their meetings shall be open to the public. You got some flexibility on how you want
When I first joined the board, we were organized in committees, so like there was a committee for personnel and finance. There was a committee for governmental affairs.
Right.
And it was typically 2 members. But there was a lot of recommendations coming out of those committees. You know, Public Works was one of them too, that would come to the board then. So those 2 people would then meet, or they would tour a facility or something like that, and then come back and make recommendations.
Yeah, now that may have been an administrative committee. You just have to look at that. You know, Jeff would have to help you with that, so, okay. That's why I say some committees are formed more in terms of being supportive of administrative functions, and they have nothing to do with the policymaking side. And some are affirmatively designed and created for the purpose of helping make policy, right? Rather than just supporting administrative staff or just learning about administrative functions, right? Okay. I don't know if Jeff can hear it, is on the line and wants to add anything. If so, he'll unmute or raise his hand, or maybe I'm not seeing and he's waving his arms at me already.
No, it's unmuted now, so.
All right.
I had my air horn going, but I guess you guys couldn't hear it. I'm taking notes. So there's a few.
You're muted. We're going to see if we can unmute you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. No, I've taken notes on a few questions that have come up, and there might be a few informational pieces that I still need, but I'm kind of outlining a few issues to follow up with you guys on, and including this committee session. But I'll probably wait to just address that with you at a future meeting and let Sam continue on.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Yeah, I know some information to gather to be able to properly take a look at all those things. Okay, next slide. All right, we talked about you use email, right? Are you going to be using email? So one of my handouts for you all is on email. Just explains a little bit further what the issues are around that. It has suggested do's and don'ts for effective use of emails elected officials. Okay? Now, I take full ownership of my suggested do's and don'ts, so if you don't like them, that's on me. Recognize that I think the word is Luddite, right? That's a person that we at CIRSA are not Luddites. We just want to make sure you appreciate the risks that surround use of email by elected officials. So check out the handout. The statute was amended way back in 1996 to say that a meeting can be any kind of gathering convened electronically. And the legislature at that time, what their intent was to make emails subject to the openness requirement. But more currently, so that meant from 1996 until now, we as municipal attorneys and others have always been thinking about, well, okay, so what kinds of emails are and are not appropriate for elected officials, even when they're copying each other or emailing back and forth. So the state legislature passed House Bill 21-1025 this year that touches on that issue. And just to move quickly through it, the legislation confirmed that there are certain categories of emails that aren't going to run afoul of the open meetings law, even if all 7 members are on that email thread, because they're not really meetings, they're not to discuss public business. And that's emails like scheduling and availability, right? The administrator sends you all who's available for a special meeting, and now all the emails are flying around. Well, that's only natural because you want to know what each other's schedules are, right? That's not a meeting. Right? If one of you just poses a question, and you copy all 7 council board members, you read the packet and you say, hey, board, and administrator, I'd like us to be prepared to discuss this question next week. That's okay, even if you send it to all of your fellow trustees. Maybe the mayor gets an email from a constituent. She's not sure if the rest of you got the same email, so she copies all of you on the response. That's also not a meeting, okay? And then sending just an FYI. Maybe you're working on updates to your building regulations and you saw something in the Denver Business Journal about construction costs on the West Slope, and you want to, dear board members, I thought you'd find this article interesting about construction costs that may relate to our future discussion about our development regulation updates. All of those are fine. Those are non-meetings under this legislation, but what's the common thing that's not happening?
There's not a discussion.
There's not a discussion going on of the merits or substance of a matter of public policy. If you're wondering what merits or substance means, the legislature was kind enough to drill down one layer further, and they say that the openness requirement applies to a discussion of the merits or substance, that is, it applies to the discussion of the essence. It's like effervescence, right? Of a matter, but we commonsensically know what it is. The takeaway is, don't use email as a substitute for the substantive deliberations and policy-making discussions that you want to have in an open meeting setting. That's what the law is designed to do and to foster. Okay, who's active on social media? Anybody? All right, so you're in a good place there. Hey, social media is a great tool, but for me, it's a good thing for putting out lighthearted information and being a champion, an ambassador, an advocate for the organization by retweeting things about the farmer's market or the festival or the street fair or the great project that we got going on. Social media, from your perspective, is not a great place to adjudicate the lofty issues of the day, nor is it ever a good place for you to jump into a discussion of land use matters, because you're judges when you do that. Okay, there's a chapter in here about social media, okay? That may be helpful to you, just to identify some of the issues around that. All right, next slide. Let's see, we've been talking about how you are required mostly to do your job open, transparently, but you are allowed to have executive sessions, but only for a limited number of purposes and only after you follow specific procedures. That's what this other handout's about, just reemphasizing the requirements around calling and convening an executive session. Make sure you use your staff and attorney and clerk as a resource to make sure you get those procedures right to a T. And then remember, when you're in executive session, it's our responsibility for all the participants in executive session to make sure we self-regulate, that we stay on topic, that we stay only on the authorized topic for which we adopted a motion to go into executive session. Also self-regulate that unless Jeff is asked that the tape be turned off, right? Oh, did you know, new folks, when you go into executive session, you have to make a recording. And that's there for limited legal compliance purposes. And the tape is only required under state law to be maintained for 90 days, and then the tape can be discarded, okay? But as a practical takeaway, recognize that when you're in executive session, unless the tape's been turned off for attorney-client device, the tape is still running, right? Tone, temperament, professionalism, courtesy, tact, always matter, public or private setting. And make sure that your systems are set to protect confidential information. Next slide. When you're in executive session, this happens particularly, do you have executive session ever, maybe once in a while, for a matter subject to negotiation?
We haven't in a long time.
It's not in a long time, okay. But remember that if you agreed that the interest of the community that you serve would be best served by having a private session at this particular point to develop a negotiation strategy, maybe we're trying to buy a piece of space, property for parkland or something, and you want to develop your negotiation strategy, as a fiduciaries, I think you owe it to each other to make sure you're on the same page about which information is confidential and how you're going to protect that information. So an easy tool in that regard is, before you break from executive session, maybe the mayor is saying, okay, of all the confidential information that we've discussed during executive session, which information, if any, leaves this room at this time, right? And who are our spokespersons? And then, even if you voted not to go into executive session, or even if you're opposed to the underlying proposition being considered, I think you're still bound as a fiduciary, right, to uphold that agreement that we have about protecting confidential information. Okay? All right. Suggestion 3 is to run good meetings. A couple of self-evident things here, but just a couple of tips around this. Yes, sir.
Before we get away from executive session, I've heard conflicting stories, I guess, or conflicting input as to whether or not notes are allowed to be taken and retained in and after executive session. Can you weigh in on that?
So my own personal opinion, check with your town attorney on that issue. But let me use the example of a personnel matter. Let's say you're getting ready to do your evaluation of the performance of the judge, and you bring with you your own notes. Okay? Well, those are your own notes. You can bring them into the session, right? If you're taking notes, right, what are you doing? You're making a record of confidential information. What do you intend to do with it? There's where the danger lies. What do you intend to do with it? Right? So some municipalities will adopt specific rules on this issue, right? So if you need a personal note to help refresh your memory later, that's fine, but you have to ask yourself, what am I going to do with those notes? How long am I going to keep them? And am I willing to give up my notes if we get into some full-blown dispute?
Those kind
Right,
of,
and so then I usually sometimes will deal with elected or appointed officials down the road who will say, man, I wish I never kept notes, right?
essentially,
Yeah.
most likely it's to be treated the same as an audio recording.
Well, it's not the official record.
Right.
That's why I asked, what are you going to do with it? The only official record of the proceeding is the recording. Right, if you took notes and you thought that somehow just because they're personal notes, I have the prerogative to share them or talk about the thoughts that were expressed there, that would be inconsistent with the fiduciary obligation that I just mentioned, right?
Can those notes be subpoenaed?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, you know, if it's not relevant to the litigation at hand, we'll attempt to quash it on relevancy grounds, those kinds of things, right? But if they are and they exist, not only may they be subpoenaed and you'd have to turn them over, but when it's a chicken scratch and nobody can read it, who are they going to call upon to decipher those notes? Yeah. And so you'll be in a deposition, right, trying to remember what you wrote and remember, oh, that's not what I meant. Oh, that's just a partial note. That's not the whole conversation that I recollect, right? So, you know, those things come up. Those things come up. And I get it, running the other direction, they can be helpful, but typically not with respect to executive session proceedings, right? Compare that to the old adage of, in personnel matters, the old adage of document, document, document. And that's why we tell your supervisors, hey, if you don't think the conduct warranted a written warning, you just want to get a verbal warning, well, you still want to keep a note that you gave the verbal warning so that you can remind the employer later and go back to your notes and go, hey, this is the second verbal warning I'm giving you on this issue. Remember back on March 15th when we sat down, I took notes of what we talked about. And so it's a different context. Yes.
So in an executive session, is it, if your attorney is present, then that constitutes attorney-client privilege and the tape is turned off?
Mere presence of an attorney does not make it an attorney-client session. It has to be related to the course of providing legal representation to the organization. Yeah.
So it could be on for a while and then shut off and then back on?
Well, it depends on what your practice is. You know, if you have, well, let me back up and tell you this, that you can only have executive sessions for very specific topics. And sometimes there's a thought of, hey, you know, we really need to have a private conversation on this. Can we go into executive session for that purpose? You got to call your administrator and check, is this an authorized topic? If the one that requires some legal analysis, Jeff is going to tell you whether or not what you're proposing to discuss in executive session really is something that can be discussed in executive session. If it's not, then just accept the fact that we're not going to pound a square peg into a round hole. There's a lot of risk around that, right? But I'm sorry, your question was on the issue of...
The question was, if you go into executive session and your attorney is there, is that automatically grounds for turning off the tape?
No. No, your attorney, the way, in the procedures that we recommend to our members, the statute says that the tape can be turned off only if, in the opinion of the attorney who's present, the discussion will constitute an attorney-client communication. Then it's turned off only for that portion. Oh, what I want to get back to is, some entities will say, we got 3 different items that we want to go into executive session about. You got to adopt, your motion's got to cover all 3 of those, right? For the attorney-client ones, you can do that and rely on Jeff's advice on that. But sometimes it's easier to deal with those taping issues if you just isolate and have the attorney-client session on its own separately from the other topics that you might have a separate executive session for. Because then you have the separate tape, right, for the attorney-client one, and you have the separate tape for those, and those can all be managed effectively.
So then, when you go into executive session and you have more than one thing, would it be best to go into executive session for the attorney-client advised, come out of executive session, come into the main room, and then declare another executive session and go back in.
I like that approach, but you can get there in terms of legal compliance, you can get there either way. Yeah. The other thing I suggest to you is when you're done with an executive session, maybe some small report out afterwards. You know, you make a statement on the record afterwards. This is particularly helpful for matters subject to negotiation because you can report back out and say, okay, we're all back in open session now, the time is, right? And as was announced previously, the executive session was for the purpose of discussing matters subject to negotiation involving potential purchase of property. And you can even say, just by way of update, we gave instruction to our negotiators, and please public rest assured that if our strategy and our instruction to our negotiators ever gets any traction, then there will be a future public agenda item, right, for further board discussion and decision on whether to pursue any particular transaction in this regard, right? Because sometimes, particularly in protracted negotiations, you may have 2, 3, 4 executive sessions, but the substantive question only appears on an agenda once at the end of the process. And that's a great time to, you know, have a little explanation and, you know, support why you use that, right? And maybe when it's the agenda item later, you're telling the public, hey, this is great. We have on the agenda item, we've been successful in negotiating with the landowner, but we have a proposed purchase or sale. We have not made any final decision. This is our open discussion of this issue. We invite comments from anyone who's interested or what have you, because it can be a little disconcerting from a transparency perspective, right? If you've got high-profile transaction on the agenda and someone says, well, let's just go ahead and make a motion to approve this because, you know, we've already talked this one to death. Well, when did that occur? So they'd like to, you know, get an explanation of how you got to this point. And I think that helps strengthen you as an institution. Okay, on meetings, you know this, but good meetings start with the meeting prep. When you get that packet, you want to start marking it up with the questions and thoughts that you're going to have for staff or the applicant at the meeting. In terms of, I think I mentioned the phrase norms of conduct. You want to have norms of conduct around how things get on the agenda. Do we have that? If I, as an individual trustee, have something that I want to see on a board agenda, how does that happen? There's no magic answer, but it's something that should be understood and agreed upon, right? There is a risk issue around the agenda, and that is the Colorado Open Meetings Law says that your posted notice and agenda shall include specific agenda items where possible, okay? So you want to be careful in that regard. You know, and even with the best of intentions, sometimes something is missed or forgotten. You get to the meeting and you go, darn it. Mayor says, time for approval of the agenda. Mayor, I got something I need to add to the agenda. Maybe, maybe not. All right. I encourage you to look at it in terms from where you sit as the empty chair principle, right? Is there a chair in the audience that would have been, that's empty, that would have been filled had someone known that we as a board were going to take up that issue this evening? And if that's so, you're probably better off holding it over for a future meeting. Now that may be markedly different than like an administrative matter. Maybe Corinne got a letter the day of the meeting from DOLA on the status of a grant application, and she wants to give you a quick update on the status of that funding that you're going to get from the state and just confirm direction, you know? Oh, she says, Mayor, ready to just add to the agenda a status update on the DOLA grant and confirm direction from you about how we're going to allocate the money in the budget. That seems a lot different than adding the, you know, high-profile controversial policy issue that's been going on for a long time. Okay. All right. Next slide. Use and expectability in your meetings, as I talked about at the outset. It goes a long way. Yes, sir.
Sorry, if we're getting away from questions in preparation for meetings.
Yeah. Okay.
In my opinion, having questions asked and answered beforehand is helpful, but then that precludes the possibility of the question being asked in public.
Yeah.
I think both have their merits. Is there anything that you recommend one over the other?
It's a balancing act. It's a balancing act. If you individually feel like, particularly if you're coming up to speed, or it's your first exposure to this process or issue, you always, I think, as the electeds have the prerogative to make that tactful call to the attorney or the administrator when you get ready for the meeting and saying, I have a question. Right? But if it relates to kind of the substantive, those deliberations that you're going to have, be prepared and be accepting of and provide some grace if the response is, oh, that's a great question. If you're asking it, I'll bet some other board members may have the same question. So we'll put together some more information and get it out to all of you. Or we'll be prepared to answer that question for you and all the board at the meeting Tuesday night. So thanks, for raising it, that kind of thing.
That was kind of my thought more about respecting time during meetings, because it can take a lot of time going through that question and answer process.
Right.
And would it be possible to have questions asked beforehand, say the questions and answers returned not only to the asker, but then to the board as a whole, or would that constitute a meeting? Say, if I asked a question of Corinne and said, can we do this? And she thinks that the other trustees might also want to hear that answer. Is it legal for her to go ahead and forward that answer to the rest of the board?
A lot of things going on there, but just a couple of takeaways. If there's not a discussion occurring among board members, then you don't have the open meetings law issue. The other thing going on is use of staff time and resources. That I think I'll ask the larger question. If it continues to recur, it's really a question ultimately of how much information do you want in your packet sometimes, right? And sometimes that discussion ends up going in the direction of your administrator or staff's going to ask, are you getting what you need from the staff reports? Would you like us to put more effort on the staff report? If it's universally yes, and we'd like them to be much more detailed, and then you may get the response, well, I need another FTE for that thing, right? So you have to be prepared for that back and forth too, but it's a matter of resourcing. Yeah, but you don't have an open meetings issue if you ask a question and the answer is pushed out one way. Okay, now in quasi-judicial proceedings, property rights proceedings, there's a new dynamic that occurs that may require, or you say, well, if we go down that road, we might even have to put out a supplemental packet so that all the interested parties to that proceeding can see this information that you're getting. But sometimes the solution of that is, oh, okay, I'll get it. I'll just hold my question till the meeting. I just want to give you a heads up that I have that question, and then be prepared to answer it.
Makes tons of sense. Thank you.
Yeah. So we pride ourselves in local government in being informal, but as the governing body, as a corporate board, you want to have some expectations around formality, whatever that looks like to you. I think common ones are, do we ourselves and do we, for the audience, send the message that we speak one at a time, that if it's public comment period, we direct our comments to the board, right? That's what the public comment period is probably for, right? Not to have free-flowing discussion of people talking over each other in the audience, right? The reason you as the corporate board have opportunity for public comments so people can speak to you and give you their comments. Do you have norms of conduct around how the public comment periods go? Right? And that can be difficult sometimes, maybe the mayor has introduced the, I think you call it introduction of guests and visitors or something.
Right, visitors and guests, yeah.
That's where people who are not on the agenda have an opportunity to come up and make comments.
Correct.
Yeah. So whatever that looks like to you, you want to have expectations around how that works. And you have the right to control the flow of your own meeting. So however you want that flow to go, right? But you should think about some norms of conduct around these examples. What if someone comes up, well, do you have a time limit? You need to be even-handed about the time limit. And is that the clock? And so you have little tools and things that help get people habituated to that. If it's public comment period, what if I come up to the podium and the mayor's laying the groundwork and said, this is your opportunity to provide comments to the board about what's ever on your mind, but we as a board, we don't take action on comments and we typically don't answer questions, but you know how it goes. Sometimes someone walks up and says, First thing, right out, I'm the first one. When is the board going to do something about this? There's a long pause. What are your tools? Whatever, however you want that to work out, that's however it's going to work out for you, right? But we encourage you to, in terms of managing the flow of your meeting and managing the flow of information to you, maybe the best thing to do in that respect is have your defined public comment period, receive all the information, and then if at the end of the public comment period, if there was a question raised that maybe, not a board member, but a staff member is best suited to answer, then you as a board can say, hey, Corinne, there was a question raised about the status of the street closure. Could you give us an update on that, right? Or sometimes the question is directly to you, right? And say, oh, someone asked when the board is going to revisit the question of requiring electric vehicle charging hookups as part of the development regulations. Just want to let you know the board looked at that last whenever, and it's not on our work plan right now. That kind of thing. But you have to decide what you want. Is it a free flow or is it that kind of thing? So everybody's got different approaches to that. But we at CIRSA, we find that most of our members say that what helps the efficiency and flow of their meeting is to have that public comment period, then deal with any questions that seem like they need a response at the end. Now, a little dicier, it's a little more in my wheelhouse from the claims perspective. Public comment starts and someone's making a personal attack. What are we going to do about that? Yeah, I call that the public commenter coming in hot. Okay? From where you said it's it's one of those jobs that requires a thick skin every now and then, right? It's probably not anything you're going to say in the moment that's going to bring the temperature down, right? So maybe the best approach in that is just to say thank you for your comments, and we call up the next person. Okay. So, any questions, thoughts around that stuff?
What about a person attacking another person in the room who's not on the board or a staff member?
You can use tools to recalibrate that, hopefully after it happens. I'm hoping, maybe then 99% of people will emulate I'm not sure if that's the right word, will reflect the rules of engagement that you try to impart upon them. You're leading by example as well, but if that happens, you probably have some tricks around this already, maybe some tips of recalibrating people. Right? Just a reminder, right? Please, no personal attacks, right? We're here to discuss public business. If you have comments, they're for the board. Don't engage in personal attacks. Okay? And I hope you don't have this, but we have this every once in a while with members on the front range where meetings get so disruptive that it's difficult to conduct business. What's your best tactic around that? Or tool?
Take a recess.
Take a recess. I will tell you, in extreme situations, we've had members who not only had to recess the meeting, but they had to adjourn the meeting and go home because of the disruption. Oh, by the way, it was a city administrator that was appointed or assigned the job of staying on for 15 more minutes to tell everybody, hey, wrap it up. The board has gone home. Why did the board go home? Well, because people were screaming and yelling at each other so much, and there was no decorum or respect for the board in terms of being able to get its work done, that they decided that they couldn't do their work, so they went home, right? And the administrator told, well, we got 15 minutes to wrap it up. It's still a public building, but in 15 minutes, we'll be closing the building and the meeting's over. I hope you never get to that point, right? But recalibration tools, I think, work for 99.99% of the folks. And most people, whether it's coming from you or people in the audience finally realize, hey, I came here, other people in the audience, I came here to talk to my legislators. So I agree. Let's all collectively as an audience remain professional, courteous, civil. That runs all directions, though. And we all want to be mutually supportive in that regard. Yeah. Any other thoughts, questions around that? Yeah.
We've had issues where people have been ejected from the meeting because of lack of civility. Typically that involves a law enforcement officer. And so I'm just curious about, what we get attacked for then is limiting free speech. Mm-hmm. And then at sometimes a law enforcement officer may be called into the meeting and the public can feel intimidated by that. Yeah. So just your thoughts on those kind of issues, because it's been very contentious for us.
Yeah, law enforcement presence ought to be tactful and discreet. It needs to be there solely for public safety and for determining in their own independent judgment and law enforcement discretion whether there are violations of laws, criminal laws going on, right? So it's true that people can be less than courteous. But where you sit as governmental actors, you never want to be perceived as squashing someone because of the content of their speech or having them removed from a meeting because of the content of their speech or the viewpoint they're expressing. Now, there are some very narrow baskets to that, right? If the speech is inciting a riot or inciting criminal activity or actually constitutes, I've forgotten the specific name of the state statute, but it's essentially disruption of a public meeting. But that's a criminal law, and that's for the law enforcement officers to decide in their own judgment whether that's being violated. Okay, so let them do that on their own. But in terms of law enforcement presence, sometimes in communities you also need that for another reason, and it's just unfortunately it's the world we live in, and that's to make sure that everyone's safe, right? And that includes yourself and your participants. What if we had some strange incident that, you know, that implicated everyone's public safety? You know, so some of our members, as a matter of course, will either have a uniformed or plainclothes officer discreetly located to the side or in the back of the room, and it's not to intimidate, it's to ensure public safety. I've told, to give you war stories, I've told members who have alternatively suggested they will have the two officers stand on either side of the board. You're not going to do that. That kind of thing. Yeah. Any other thoughts, suggestions on that?
Well, it's very contentious, and just in my time on the board, I've seen people, and actually participated at one time as a member of the public, getting thrown out with a partner, and, you know, it just felt really awkward, and in essence, it was because of interrupting someone.
Yeah.
You know, it was not following meeting decorum.
Right.
You know, that doesn't sound like that's something that someone can be ejected for.
Generally not, okay, unless it falls into one of those narrow exceptions, okay? But a couple other things you can do to minimize the risk around that and hopefully get more buy-in is think about, some of our members, I don't see them, but we post like guidelines for public participation, or we have a handout around that, and then eventually we're habituating that, hey, at the end of the day, people want an effective vehicle to be heard, right? And they just want to be heard, right? And so usually, except for the ones on the extreme, and they're out there and we deal with them in claims, right? That usually if the rules are understood and I know that I'll have an opportunity to be heard and that, hey, I agree with your approach of let's all be civil, then you're gonna get that. Yes, you're gonna have the occasional disruption. As by way of coming attractions, at our CIRSA annual meeting in June, I will be speaking directly on this topic in a presentation called the Law of Civility. And we're going to drill down and spend about an hour and a half talking about exactly what the state of the law is on whether one can enforce or impose civility, whether it's coming from the outside or whether it occurs at the dais or whether it's in the workplace or on social media. So we'll be talking about that more in June.
When and how do we get access to that?
Oh, that'll be at our CIRSA general membership meeting. And if you're going to the CML conference, you'll get that. If not, we'll probably be posting that presentation or a summary of it afterwards on our website. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Any other thoughts around that?
That's the 100-year bash, is that what that is? Or
Oh, that's CML's. They've been around longer than us. Yeah, but we
Make
just.
sure I'm not confusing
Yeah.
annual events here. So
Yeah.
what you're talking about is CIRSA's.
CIRSA's, yeah, and it's usually the first day of the CML conference.
Oh, okay, that's why I was going.
We have our meeting. Any final thoughts or questions around that? Let's keep rolling. Let's, I want to be respectful of your time, so I'm just going to rack up some thoughts about ethics and due process. So next slide. You are subject to, this is another handout that I put at your places, so let's work off that. That's the one that says ethics handout, CIRSA training. So you all became subject to the Colorado State Standards of Conduct, okay, and there's a lot going on in those. But I just want to touch on conflicts of interest, confidential information, and gifts. So on conflicts of interest, just recognize that there are state laws that say when you're in a conflict of interest situation, right, you have certain obligations as an elected official. So we have to remember what's a conflict situation. Okay, so it's basically this: whenever the board is going to take some kind of action that affects your own personal financial interest, that directly and substantially affects your own personal financial interest, you're in a conflict situation. So to borrow liquor licensing, if we have a liquor license request for a new restaurant in town, and you happen to be a 25% owner of that business, in a conflict situation. So you have a couple of obligations. You have to disclose your conflict of interest on the record at the meeting, at the beginning, not at the end, right? And mayor says, next agenda item is the new restaurant liquor license request for 101 Main. Mayor, I need to make a disclosure. I have a conflict of interest. Okay? Then you have to recuse yourself from the board's discussion and vote. Okay? And you also have to refrain from attempting to influence the decision of the other decision makers. Okay? Do you leave the room when you have a conflict of interest?
Best practice.
I think that's best practice.
Really don't, but yeah.
Yeah, it's best practice. And the reason it's best practice, it doesn't come up all that often, but remember that last piece I mentioned is don't attempt to influence. So I mentioned it because I want the person, who did all the right things. They made the disclosure, they stepped off the dais, they're not participating in the discussion. I don't want them to in any way be subject to even an unmeritorious allegation that somehow they were attempting to influence the other decision makers. So if you have a conflict, I think it's best to have a representative. That would be best practice. Have some other representative represent your interest for you. Okay? There are ways to do it. I mean, you are allowed, you're not required to give up your interest, and you probably all own a home here, or rent a home, or have property interest, right? And so you have a constitutional right to appear before the board with respect, like anybody else. You need a variance or something, you have a right to request that. But you are also subject to these ethics rules because you're an elected official. So I think for your own protection, right, you want to think about, well, how am I going to approach that process? I think a good solution to that is have some other representative represent your interest for you. Recognize that an interest for purposes of these rules is not only your own pocketbook or wallet, but it's certain derivative interests. So if it's if you have an ownership interest in a business, or you hold a position as a director or an officer of a corporation, or you're a consultant for a business that's appearing before the board, all of those are conflict situations. Okay. Any other? Yes.
So say you're on a homeowners association board and there's an issue coming to the board about how the town treats homeowners associations. Is that a conflict of interest?
Are you a director or officer of that
Yes.
of that particular homeowners association? That's a nonprofit?
Yes.
Okay, so the dual membership in and of itself, in my opinion, is not a conflict. Please check with Jeff on this, because that's okay. But that in and of itself is not. And then beyond that, we get to the question of whether you have any other financial relationship to it. Yeah, okay.
It's unpaid.
And then the next analysis is the question of whether it's the same type of interest that's held by anybody else in a homeowners association. If it is, right, the state law doesn't say it as clearly as I would prefer, but if it's a common interest that's held by a lot of people in the same situation, right, then we're getting away from that linkage where the decision must have a direct and substantial impact on your particular interest, right? Yeah. Okay. Yes.
I've seen, we allow public comments on motions in general for this process. I have seen trustees recuse themselves and then speak as a member of the public. Is that, in your opinion, contrary to not participating in the discussion?
Well, to give you an example of some of our members, I don't know if you have this or not, it sounds like you don't. Some members will say you're required to vote on any matter in front of the board unless you have a conflict, unless you're legally required to step away. Whether you have that or not, it does raise this question. Are you stepping aside from what you were elected to do? And I'm setting aside that I don't put one weight on the issue one way or the other, but I'll just identify the issue. Is that by doing this, did I have more or less power when I was elected and I'm serving in my official capacity, speaking about the issue from the dais? Right? So those are just some things to think about. And I will also tell you that, again, it's not that easy to take that hat off. Take that hat off. I'm going to go down here and talk as a citizen. Well, everybody still knows it's a trustee, and so some people will say, why is he sitting up there voting on the matter? He could say the same things as long as he doesn't have a conflict. He wasn't required to step aside. He could say the same things and perhaps even be more influential. He directs his comments to just his 6 colleagues, right? So I don't know if there's some underlying dynamic that further influences the issue, but I guess if you want me to cut to the chase, I would suggest not doing that.
Just excuse yourself from there.
Yeah. Okay. Confidential information, there is a state law that says do not disclose or use confidential information that you acquire in the course of your official duties to further substantially your own personal financial interests. That's self-evident, we know that. The practical thing that comes up every once in a while, very infrequently, but there may be some bit of public information that does relate to your own business interests. But at some point, you may have initially learned it in some confidential setting, and you're not sure whether or not this little piece of information is in the public realm or not. You just want to ask your staff or your attorney. Right? If there's a written document, hey, that confidential memo that was given to us on this particular issue, like that little bit of information that relates to businesses operating in town, is that public information, private information? Right? Just ask, you want to protect yourself in that regard. But you have a fiduciary duty not to do that. And then finally on gifts, so there's a lot going on with gifts. Do you get a little stipend for being on the board?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not the lavish salary.
Oh, it is a lavish set.
And it's not, and I'm also here to tell you, it's not the lavish gifts, and you know this, that bring us to public service. It's love of the community and our desire to help our community move forward. So, but more seriously, there are gift rules in Colorado that apply to elected officials, okay? And it's actually in our state constitution. And I'm not proud of this, but I just got 2 sentences for you on how these rules work in the interest of time. So the first piece of it is this. Under Amendment 41, right, it basically says this: do not accept any gift of more than $65 from any one person in any one year if it any way relates to your being a public servant, right? Unless you give equal consideration in return. Okay.
Unless what?
Unless you give equal or better consideration in return. Second, don't accept a gift no matter what its value, if it's clear to a reasonable person that the gift was being offered to you to curry your vote or influence your action on a matter, or to reward you for some action that you've taken as a public official, okay? Both the constitutional and the statutory gift rules do have certain exceptions that you'll want to be familiar with. You know, for example, a campaign contribution is not an impermissible gift. It's subject to campaign finance reporting, but it's not an impermissible gift. A small token of appreciation in public service, like a plaque or something like that, is not an impermissible gift. But the takeaway on gifts is this: so much of it is just that practical. What does this look like? What is it in the timing and context? What's the timing and context of this gift that's being offered to me? And if the timing and context is not appropriate, then we're just going to decline the gift, and we'll be just fine, right? Okay. Next slide. Finally, there's just a slide here that I think it's touched on some things that we may have touched on during meetings, but you got all the ethics rules, and they're out there, and you're going to want to find that state code of ethics and become familiar with what the expectations are. But beyond that, right, commit yourselves to high standards of personal conduct in terms of supporting the institution of the board as a board. And I think it's a wise board that helps identify, right, and address early any concerns that may bubble up around this issue, right? And I've listed on the slide some of the things that people have called me about at CIRSA with concerns about these issues, because they're asking, are there any rules that we can adopt around this? right? And what I usually say to them, was it a matter of personal conduct involving us as board members? Well, we attempted just to tell our colleagues, hey, I'm uncomfortable with this, or this doesn't feel right to me. We need to discuss this, right? In terms of supporting each other and supporting the institution of council. At worst, you end up just agreeing respectfully to disagree, right? But at best, you've strengthened your relationship because then everybody knows where everybody's coming from on an issue. And you've attempted to try and resolve that before it becomes like an insidious problem for you as board members or as a board, okay? So commit to identifying those things and addressing them early so that they don't debilitate you or sap your strength, either individually or as a board, all right? Last thing I need to get on your radar, suggestion 6, it has to do with due process. And this is a separate training topic in and of itself. It's an hour or more. I just want to get it on your radar. So you have this great, interesting job as a trustee, because sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, the primary job is corporate governance and policymaking. You're a legislator, right? But sometimes you're different. You're a judge, right? And you're making decisions that affect individuals' protected property rights. And in local government in Colorado, that's primarily for land use matters and licensing matters. Marijuana licensing, liquor licensing, development, special uses, subdivisions, zoning, that kind of thing. When you're doing that, you have a specific applicant in front of you, right? And this is where what I call the due process rules of engagement kick in. You go, where does all this stuff come from? Well, we all know where it comes from. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So if we want that awesome power, right, to decide, hey, this or that license is not appropriate for our community, or this or that development is not appropriate for our community in accordance with our standards and guidelines, then we have to be committed, right, to upholding the principle that people are entitled to their due process. Okay? So a due process hearing has got a couple of nifty components that we all know intuitively exist, but I'll break them down for you. When you have one of these due process hearings, you have an applicant in front of you, right? And you're going to have a noticed public hearing. We usually give more notice. That explains that strange large sign in the building when you're getting, right? Or the yard sign that we stick out in front of a development. Right? So we have more notice, and then we're going to have an evidentiary hearing in front of the board, where everybody gets to say their piece and put in their evidence in front of you, the judges. And then we're going to make a decision that's based on the evidence submitted at the hearing. That decision is going to be based on our existing standards, not on our own personal preferences or other irrelevant criteria, right? And the decision is going to be made by a fair and impartial decision maker. That's you all. See how markedly different that is than like just general sausage making in the legislative realm, right? Like if your current legislative priority is we need to change our animal control ordinances. Well, heck, you can lobby and be lobbied anywhere you want. You can vote no or yes because you love or hate animals. You can take your counsel from anyone, anywhere, right? But in this quasi-judicial role, it's different because you're sitting in judgment, just like a judge. That's why we call it quasi-judicial. And that's why the rules of engagement are different. They're there to ensure fundamental fairness. So, can you go to the next slide for a second? Let's go back again. The last bullet here in the blue ink is 2 recordings that we made and posted to our website on basic training for quasi-judicial matters. So, one thing I do want to leave with you tonight is just recognize that for those types of matters, right, where you're deciding applications, you have to remain detached and neutral and not get involved until the matter is before you at the public hearing. Okay? And that includes this rule that prohibits what we call outside the hearing communications, ex parte communications. That's simply a communication with an interested party about the substance or merits of the matter under consideration outside the hearing. Right? It's just a local government analogy of this. Like if I owe you money and you get sick of waiting around for it, you sue me and our trial's tomorrow in court, your expectation and right under the due process clause is that I'm not on the phone with the judge the night before going, hey, Judge, how's it looking? You're going to vote for me, right? That kind of thing. You have the same obligation at a local government level, right? It's not that we don't want to hear from folks, but as the decision makers, you have to remind them, hey, I can't engage with you about this until I've heard all the evidence. So please come to the hearing. I want to hear from you. And another good way to explain that to your constituents is to remind them, hey, if it were, you understand that I'd love to hear from you, but I can't talk with you about why I should vote yes or no now because I haven't heard the evidence. That's why we have the public hearing. So we'd love to hear from you. Can you come to the public hearing? Great. If you can't come, you can send in written comments. But then turn around and say, if it were your application, if you were the one applying for this land use approval or this liquor license, would it seem fair to you, right, that the decision maker was talking to others about your application or being lobbied about why they should vote no or yes, right, without you knowing it? That's just the fundamental cornerstone of due process, is everybody gets to hear everybody else's arguments for or against something, okay? So staff will help you more understanding that piece of it, but that is a critically important piece of it. And I know it's a lonely part of the job, because you're gonna have, I don't know if you have one, but you have controversial marijuana dispensary application on next week's agenda. What's the natural inclination of the citizen? I want to talk to my decision maker and tell them why they ought to vote yes or no, right? But we have to stand back, and the impartiality piece is in play too, right? You may hate marijuana dispensaries personally, but you don't want to be the person quoted in the newspaper the week before saying, I will never vote in favor of another marijuana dispensary again. Does that make you sound like a fair and impartial judge? No. The legal rule in play is prejudice, right? That if you predetermine the matter, right, you have prejudgment bias, then naturally due process would suggest you shouldn't be a decision maker. And that's the trouble that can create. Anyone have any questions around that stuff? There's a lot more of that in videos, but I hope that's just a helpful introduction to that. Yes, sir.
I have maybe I can formulate my question without. So in the instance where this due process is not given,
Yeah.
not that someone presents themselves for processing, but they avoid process, right?
Yeah.
What would be an appropriate board response to someone who is avoiding process? For instance, if someone builds a fence that is on their, out of bounds, where, what power or what obligation do we have as a board to take and what action?
Right, okay, yeah. Great question. That's not implicating these rules necessarily, right?
Right.
That might be implicating compliance with town requirements, right? So it's the idea of someone, hey, I was driving and I saw somebody put a fence up. Did they have a permit to do that? Who does that question go to? Administrator. And they'll look into that. And they'll also be the ones who are on the front lines of making sure that we're applying our rules in an even-handed and predictable manner. Now, sometimes people on the receiving end of that, their impression or perception is, well, I'm the only one who's getting picked on here. Well, we have to have a ready response to that. We need to be, the worst case situation, the ones that we deal with, we need to be able to defend you in terms of saying that the people who are charged with administration of that ordinance were doing it in a fair and even-handed manner. That's not a due process issue.
So it's more of a town ordinance thing?
Yeah, it's more of a town issue.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, right. But you, from where you sit, I think you can always point out to your administrator if you have a question or you see something like, was that done? I saw a new building was built all of a sudden. And you may even say, look, I don't need to know the answer, but I was just curious. I didn't see any construction sign or we didn't have anything on our agenda. Was that thing just appropriately permitted? And staff would say, yeah, it's taken care of. Or it may say, oh no, we saw that too. And our building inspector went out and talked to them and reminded them that they needed to stop until they got a permit and we're taking care of it. Yeah.
I think where it gets confusing is when we have very controversial things in the community that there's an expectation that the board make a decision on. That's different than having a public hearing on like a variance or, a specific thing that, like we have a tree thing going on right now with a tree that fell down.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people that showed up at the last meeting about this tree falling down and how we are expected to, rule on that. And so in a small town, it's really hard not to have people coming up to you. You're going to be making a decision about that, but a lot of people will be talking to you about that tree stuff.
Yeah, I mean, part of it, there's a lot of things that may be swirling around there. Do we have a tree ordinance? Where was the tree? Is it really our issue? Or is it people asking us to get involved in something where the government doesn't have a role? Sometimes the answer to those things is unclear, right?
It seems to be unclear here.
Yeah, but I would encourage you, just in a broad sense, those kinds of issues that come up, it's your prerogative that you can use to your advantage and use as you should to take the time you need and get the information you need to figure out what your options are. And, among the whole array of things, we may end up deciding that there are many options, that this really isn't a town issue. Or that it may say, well, it's not usually a town issue, but if the board, a majority of the board, would like to get involved, here are the options that are within the municipal framework that you can think about exercising. Or maybe it's a third one. We've already got something in place to deal with those issues through some other ordinance or policy, right? Yeah. There's a lot of pressure on answering questions promptly and quickly and putting governmental resources on things right away, but you always want, these things don't in a legal sense always create precedent, but of course, in your world, it can leave the impression of creating precedent. So I think you have the right and prerogative to slow things down, get good information, spend time talking as a board with your support staff about what are our options, and then deciding, do we want to get involved, and then how do we get involved given the options that have been laid out for us?
Can I ask a question?
No, we're not doing questions, Suzanne. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. So,
I'm on the
Yes.
zoning board of adjustment. I had a question about the due process. Does it count if we aren't using the correct boards? We're holding a hearing, but we're not following our rules, and it's not going to the board that's authorized in our code. How does due process work?
That's more of a jurisdictional question. So, it's a question, and that's a Jeff question. Sometimes, particularly in the land development world and in the question of, a classic example of this, particularly if do you have PUDs, land developments?
No, we haven't had any.
Yeah, but I give you just, so maybe it's a good example just to illustrate the point. Sometimes entities will have plan development codes where you can request relief or a different type of development than the strict rules by submitting a plan development. In the plan development, the entity with jurisdiction of that might be the Planning Commission. But by the same token, the Board of Adjustment might have jurisdiction over a variance. So it becomes this initial question of, given what's being requested here, who actually has jurisdiction over what's being requested? So with that, my radar went off and I said, that's a question, if that kind of thing arises, that's a good question for Jeff.
I'm not sure if I'm muted or not, but can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. No, I was just to tie a little bit of a bow on that due process discussion. I'm happy to provide some follow-up on quasi judicial proceedings and kind of the rules of the road there that Sam's already touched on. But I did want to make clear that these due process considerations, to be clear, they don't come up on anything that comes up in front of the board for discussion. It's when there's a property interest at play, and those most often take the form of a land use application, a liquor license application, or something like that. And so in any event, if there's more questions there or otherwise, I can address that down the road.
Yeah, because you do have a hat that's got a couple of different edges on it. Sometimes you're a legislator and these quasi-judicial rules don't apply to that. So in a legislative context, you can be partial. You can take your counsel wherever you wish. You can talk with people before the matter comes to the board, right? As long as you're complying with the open meetings rules and things like that. When it's a property rights matter, that's where you are required to remain detached and neutral and not get involved in front of you. Among the two links on that slide, the second one is the what I would call more of the basic training that further describes what's typically quasi-judicial, what's not, and what the rules are. And some of this is also further explained on the last handout that I put at your places. All right. To wrap things up, move away from some of the legal stuff, just my final comment here is, first suggestion is to embrace wise leadership, so to get back to the 40,000-foot level, right? You know, as a body and as a board, commit to, you know, a no surprises approach with each other. Your meetings ought not to have, you know, gotcha moments. As I said earlier, I think it's always your prerogative to make that tactful call to your attorney or administrator if you have a question in advance of the meeting. All in view of helping support the organization, because if it's a question that they get a heads up on, then they're prepared to answer it, or can prepare to answer it at the meeting. Your meetings ought not to be gotcha moments, and they are not a forum for staff bashing, right? Deal effectively with discord. We talked about that a little earlier, wherever that's coming from, right? We can disagree without being disagreeable. And if we have friction, you know, we want to resolve that before it becomes intractable discord. And you certainly ought not to let discord drive your agenda or how you interact with each other or citizens or staff. And, you know, be willing to discuss those things and move forward collectively after a difficult decision, right? Always, always, always think in terms of committing yourselves to civility and mutual respect with each other, with the staff that's there to support and help you, mutual respect with citizens and applicants that come before you. From their perspective, an applicant, someone wants to speak in a public meeting, it can be kind of anxiety-inducing for them, particularly if they're the one whose interest is at stake. You want to make sure that they feel comfortable, that they understand the rules of procedure, that they're being heard, right? But by the same token, you also have the right and responsibility to control how you want your meetings to go and how you want to conduct your business on behalf of this corporation, right? So keep all those things in mind. Always think in terms of acting as we, and remember that you're the stewards of the town's best interests and assets. So with that, I'll open up to any final questions, and I do want to thank the mayor and board for the chance to come down and visit with you all again. Thank you very much, staff, for everything you do for the town.
Thank you very much, Sam.
Thanks.
Really informative. Thank you so much. And maybe,
I'm sorry, I mentioned that when I mentioned in response to your question about norms, I did bring with me, and I'll get to your staff and hand out just some samples of, we put together a couple of templates on common things where my answer has always been not to push back unnecessarily, but to say, well, maybe that's an issue that you all, whether it's dealing within the governing body or with staff or with the public, where a discussion around what's our norm would be helpful. And here's just a couple of bullet points to talk about subject matter in that area. So I'll leave it.
Great, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Are they on your webpage?
These are not. So
Okay.
I'll hand these out. Yep. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Much appreciated.
Thanks, everyone.
Mary, I just want to let you know that I heard back from you that a person come up and.
Thank you very much.
And he, and he couldn't make it, so I'd like to tell him that all the information that would be in his mailbox.
Yeah, exactly.
He can see
Good to see you.
Okay, cool.
Sorry.
Thank you.
See you again.